Yeah. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is David Bassett, and I'm a 2012 grad at the college. Um, I majored in history, so this will be fun for me tonight. My role in the Alumni Office is to oversee our various alumni programs. We have a class ambassador program that helps to highlight communication from the Alumni Office to classmates. Then we have regional chapters that I work with the leaders of those chapters to help put on events. We have 8 chapters right now, working on getting a 9th one started. And then the other program that I do besides these webinars is also our kind of opportunity for career connections. So we have affinity groups for alumni who are in finance, education, law, health professions, and these are LinkedIn groups as well as a quarterly e-newsletter. So if any of these things sound interesting to you, let me know. This webinar series is something that we're just starting, and I'm really grateful for Dr. Smith to kind of lead us off with this. But we'll be doing them about every other month. We'll have professors speaking about things they love, as well as alumni just sharing from their wealth of experience. We have some very accomplished alumni. They, appear in our the awards banquets and all sorts of things like that. And I'm excited in the future to bring those folks on as well to share some of their wisdom. This evening, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Miles Smith on his book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. He first came to teach at Hillsdale in 2014. Dr. Smith received his PhD from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. His research is on the U.S. South and the Atlantic world, generally focusing on intellectual history. He's the author of 2 books and hails originally from North Carolina. Please direct all questions to me in the chat, and at the end of the talk, I will direct them to Dr. Smith during the Q&A. Thank you again for joining us, and now let's hear from Dr. Smith.
First off, I assume that most of you are alums, and therefore you were at one point students. And so in as much as you are students, you're also definitely friends. And so I want to speak to you tonight as really as friends and having a conversation about my discipline, what I do professionally with you as a friend. You are, as a Hillsdale student, you are the reason I get up in the morning. And as an alumni, you do not cease to be that. We don't stop thinking about you. I still think about so many of you. So if I had you in class, you are missed. I miss you. I hope you'll come see us in person as often as you can. I love it. I know my colleagues do as well. What I want to do tonight is really talk about not merely my book. I did write a book, and I tell people my favorite thing about it is it has a pretty cover. It looks very American, and it's called Religion and Republic. And I want to note that it's called Religion and Republic and not Church and State, because I want to begin the conversation I want to have with you talking about something that's more complex, I think, than merely church and state. The reason I wrote this book is if you are in the ether of politics and religion, you know that those two things kind of continually go together. It's an election year again. And so in election years, those conversations tend to sort of be ramped up. And every 4 years or so, we have a conversation about, say, the relationship between religion and politics. People are using Christianity for political purposes, or maybe on the right, it's that people are sort of adopting secularism, trying to get Christianity out of the public square. Recently, those conversations have kind of metastasized. They've gotten into the intellectual world. And you've seen a conversation about, on the Roman Catholic side, integralism, and on the Protestant side, Christian nationalism. And they're sort of related concepts. What I wanted to do was sort of cut through the noise, cut through all the political stuff, and sort of say, okay, what did Americans actually think about religion and the political order in the early republic, when we're sort of forming our government, forming our society, and figuring out what we believe about these respective things. The reason I didn't title it Church and State is because I'm pretty clear in the introduction, and I want to be clear tonight. I'm not actually writing about the religion between churches and the US government in this book. What I want to propose is that religion is not merely a churchly construction to Americans in what we call the early republic. I've defined that era, by the way, as between 1789 and 1860. That's the broad early republic. Some people define it a bit more narrowly, but it basically is any time before the Civil War, after the signing of the Constitution. And so I want to say, what did Americans believe about religion and its relationship to the civil and political orders in the era? And what I found was this. Almost every major American intellectual, every major American religious leader, every major American politician is comfortable with what we would call disestablishment. No one's debating whether or not it's a good thing to get rid of state churches. Almost everybody is pretty comfortable with that. There's no debate. No Americans are sitting around in the 1830s going, oh, I really wish we had a state church back. I wish there was a resurrected Church of England or a resurrected Church of Scotland. No one's doing that. By the same token, they're completely convinced that religion has, the way I term it in the book, is a necessary and salutary place in American civic and political life. So what did that mean? It meant they understood religion had to have some sort of institutional apparatus to work itself out in civic life and social life and in political life. And that institutional apparatus wasn't churches. This isn't, they weren't pleading for a resurrected establishmentarian order. They think that religion is built into other institutions in civic life and in political life. And they think that because it's built into other institutions, we don't need to do a sort of establishmentarian project. We don't need to go back to Calvinist Geneva or Lutheran Germany or 16th century papal Italy. We don't need to do those things in order to have a healthy Christian, a public Christianity, a healthy religious order in the United States. And so the term I came up with, and I like it, and I've sort of settled with, and I wrote it into the book, is Christian institutionalism. Most Americans in the beginning of the 19th century, the very end of the 18th century, believed that there was a Christian institutional commitment that worked its way out in American civics and in American politics. And so what my book basically does is take you through each of the institutions where you see that. And I'll just name a few of them. The first one, I think the most obvious one, is state legislatures. There's Christian institutional commitments in state legislatures. I note in the book that these are usually, but not all the time, Protestant. And the reason they're usually Protestant in the era is because only somewhere in the order of 10 to 15% of the religious population in the United States is Roman Catholic in that era. So if you're going to have a Christian institutional commitment, particularly before the 1840s, it's almost always going to be Protestant. That changes. And the good news is for Roman Catholics is there was a sort of malleability in that order that allowed them to sort of create their own institutions slowly but surely. So by the 1860s, for example, you have some of the same type of institutions that would have been built by Protestants being built by Roman Catholics, particularly in New York State, in New Orleans, the city of Baltimore, Philadelphia, typically, but not all the time, in large cities. So that sort of malleable order, that malleable Protestant order, I note, wasn't a churchly order, but it wasn't any less Christian. It wasn't any less institution. There was no one who was sort of saying, we're sort of indifferent to whether it sort of sticks around or not. No, they think it needs to stick around. And because of that, they really commit to it by institutions. And you see that in state legislatures. For example, there's Trinitarian commitments in state constitutions. There's stipulations about what you can and can't say, for example, about religion. These aren't, by the way, considered free speech or anti-free speech constructions. They're saying, look, if you're going to be in government, you have to understand that we think that there's certain moral and religious ideals that prop up a sustainable constitutional order. And you can't just throw away those at random. And so state legislatures are committed to that. Another place you see this is in American diplomacy. American diplomacy is predicated on the idea that the United States is not a churchly nation. It's not a sort of establishmentarian nation. There is no specific religion that the president has to have or that the State Department has to have, but nonetheless, it acts in the international order with Christian commitments. And it's sometimes even more specifically Protestant commitments. Now, again, that's malleable. The Protestantness kind of goes away and it becomes something bigger than Protestant. It includes Roman Catholics, and it will eventually include Jews. But no one is sort of saying that this is something that is sort of indifferent, that maybe we're secular or maybe we're universalist. Or no. They're not saying that at all. They're pretty clear and they're pretty consistent that the United States acts as a Christian country in the world. Another place you see it is Sabbath laws. There's this commitment to treating Sunday as a holy day across the United States. And this isn't merely a sort of a Calvinist commitment. It's not a Puritan commitment. There's this idea that the Sabbath is kind of built into society. And it's particularly built into Christian societies. Now, people observe the Sabbath different ways. And I talk about some of the actual disagreements on how the Sabbath should be practiced. But there's no one in the United States who sort of sees the Sabbath as being something that we can be completely indifferent to. So even one of the big debates in the era, the debate in the era, by the way, is not whether things should close down on Sundays. Almost everything closes down on Sundays in the era, whether the person was religious or not. Most businesses shut down on Sundays. Why? Well, because they understood, okay, we have institutional commitments to kind of protecting this day. Local governments would do it, state governments do it. No one is sort of saying, you know what, we're going to go to war against Sunday laws. The debates about the Sabbath are like this: whether the government should run its mail on Sunday or not. So this is actually what they're debating. No one's debating the relationship of businesses to the Sabbath, or the relationship of churches to the Sabbath, or even the relationship of, say, state governments or local municipal boards to the Sabbath. What they're debating is, should the federal government run its mail on Sundays? The federal government, by the way, didn't do that, and they started that up in 1810. And so there's the debate, should we shut it down again? And actually the debate ends up being decided, no, the government can run its mail on Sunday. What if there's something important? But that's the type of debates they're having. No one's actually debating whether a business should stay open or not. Everybody kind of closes down. So you have Sabbath laws are sort of a place where you see that civic and even political commitment to Christianity remaining pretty durable. Another place you see this is the US government's relationship with missionaries. And I think this is the one that's kind of surprising to me. If you're like me, you sort of assumed that missionaries go off and they don't have anything to do with government. They're really just there for a spiritual mission. They're there to save souls. And that's kind of what the idea of missionaries that we have in the early 21st century is. They're there to save souls. Almost every significant missionary that I could find in the era thinks of themselves as not merely saving souls, but of bringing Christian civilization to the people that they're ministering to. And this is what's really interesting. They see a completely symbiotic relationship with what we might call Western civilization and Christianity. They don't see separation there. If you're going to become a Christian, you're also going to change your cultural habits. No one thinks that you can sort of be, right, a savage and be a Christian. Now, we can debate whether they're right or wrong on that, but the important thing to note is if you were a missionary in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, or even you could go back to the 1780s, you're thinking that if I go minister to these people and bring them the gospel, I'm also bringing them American civilization, which is Christian civilization. It's all the same. It's all in a symbiotic relationship. And so what's interesting is we, again, would be surprised at this. The federal government was in the business of funding missionaries. The federal government funds missionaries into the American interior. Now, what's interesting is that this actually isn't as strange as it sounds. One of the things we know, if you study the American missionary movement, is in the 1950s, guess what? Almost everywhere that American missionaries went, they're doing the work of anti-communism, right? They're routinely associated with the CIA in Africa. So it's not as strange as it might seem, but it sort of strikes us as weird because we've really believed, guess what? Missionaries are doing this spiritually. No, they're not. Missionaries are deeply involved with furthering the aims of not merely American civilization, but American politics. Guess what? If you are someone who's interested in westward expansion and sort of civilizing the interior so you can have territorial governments govern more efficiently and have the postal services run better, wagon roads cut more efficiently, rivers dredged, you don't want to be attacked by a population who doesn't share any civilizational commitments with you at all. So guess what? Missionaries are a first step to not just American civilization, but American political formation. People see the missionaries as doing the initial work in that. So missionaries are a part of this sort of civic political institutionalism as well. Another thing you would see is the United States' relationship with Indians more broadly. The way that Americans related to Indians, to Native American peoples, was as Christian peoples interacting with usually non-Christian peoples or converted populations. So the American government, when it interacts with missionaries, is doing so, missionaries to Native Americans, is doing so as a Christian country. What's completely fascinating is there was a tension even within the government. You have different governments wanting to do different things. Routinely, when the government sort of allows missionaries to do its thing, when the government sort of says, hey, missionaries, we're going to pay you when they go talk to Native Americans, everything's more pacific, everything's more peaceful. When the government doesn't include missionaries, there tends to be more belligerence between Native Americans and the federal government. So that was a surprise to me. Probably the last thing that I noticed and the most compelling thing about how the United States sort of built religious institutional commitments into its civic and political order was in education. Universities. Universities, and particularly state universities, were also de facto Christian colleges in the era. I took that for granted. I was educated at a state college that had at one point an Anglican clergyman as its head. I attended the College of Charleston, an old colonial college in South Carolina, and at one point it was headed by an Episcopal clergyman, Jasper Adams. A lot of schools throughout the country were headed by clergymen, so that's not so much of a surprise. But what surprised me was how committed those colleges and universities remained to what we might call Christian sociocultural formation. They're not just training you how to be a good American. What they think is in order to be a good American, you have to be catechized completely in Christian moral precepts and in Christian virtue conceptions. That you have to do that. That's actually the first step to being a good American and to being an educated American. And one of the professorships you will see throughout these good examples, University of Indiana, University of South Carolina, University of Michigan, all have it, a titled, quote unquote, Professor of the Evidences of Christianity. So you have state-funded education basically giving Christian apologetics courses. And that's not because they want everyone to be churchy. They're not trying to do Sunday school hour. This is what's really compelling, is none of them are doing this merely because they want people to be nice or to be moral or to not sin. They're not doing that for a churchly purpose. I want to say that again. They're not doing Christian moral formation and teaching Christian virtue concepts for a churchly purpose. In fact, they're pretty open in their claim that they're doing secular education. But they understand that the secular in the American order needs to be demonstrably Christian because that's what they think the American political order is built on. A Christian, moral, social, civic, political formation. They just don't think you can escape it. And the state governments recognize that, and they put state monies towards it. What's interesting is that no one thinks This is an abrogation of the establishmentarian principle. No one thinks this is a First Amendment problem. You don't have people raising their hands in the air and say, hey, the state government can't establish a professorship of the evidences of Christianity because that's establishing a state religion. No one thinks that. And the reason they don't think that is because when we look at the First Amendment, we actually read it very differently than they did in the era. So we tend to think, well, religion. When it says religion, what it means is sort of any religious habit. No, when they say religion, there will be no religious test. What they're meaning is I can't impose a denominational identity on you in order for you to hold office. There is no suggestion whatsoever, though, that you can't have religious institutional commitments and hold office. That's not what they're doing. And this is important because there's actually quite a few blasphemy laws on the books in this era. And those blasphemy laws would be probably a bit surprising to us. By the way, there's blasphemy laws still on the books in some states today. My home state of North Carolina, there's still a couple. Right here in Michigan, there's actually still a couple. What you realize is that blasphemy was seen as not a churchly sin. It's not a churchly disorder. So we have this idea that, well, blasphemy is something that's strictly limited to churches. No, they would have understood blasphemy as something that was social and public. There's a case in 1811 in New York where a man very publicly disrespects the Holy Family, including the Virgin Mary, in a pub in New York. And mind you, this is a pub. This isn't a church. This isn't a school. It's a pub. People are drinking, they're having a beer, and a guy gets up and disrespects the Holy Family. And guess what? All these guys at the pub, they rat him out. They say, hey, you can't say that. Right? Imagine a bunch of guys drinking today out at the pub and grub or something like that, or down at the bowling alley. Somebody says something disrespectful about the Virgin Mary, and people call the cops. That's what was happening in a place like New York, Protestant New York. This isn't a Roman Catholic New York. This is Protestant New York. And the government of New York says, you can't do that in public. So the guy's thrown in jail, actually. So this is not seen, by the way, as some sort of, right, Inquisition style government. No one looks at that and says, oh my gosh, we've fallen back into the Middle Ages. Everyone pretty much supports, by the way, the judges who make that distinction. James Kent, the Chancellor of New York, is the one who basically writes the sentence. And so no one thinks, oh man, we've gone back to the Dark Ages. A lot of people think, well, that's what you get. You can't do that in public. And so when we think of the First Amendment, we're thinking of something very differently. Our reading of it changed. And what we tend to think of is that, well, the First Amendment is how it was in perpetuity. Really, a lot of the things that we associate with religion are creations of the middle of the 20th century. Most of the way that we think of as the American settlement about religion is a creation of the 20th century. And why do we sort of get there in the middle of the 20th century? In the middle of the 20th century, that's when you have people go back and look at the famous letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. That's the famous letter where we get the phrase separation of church and state. The wall of separation is actually the phrase that's used. And of course, separation of church and state isn't the Constitution. It's from this one letter. Why then does that letter sort of stay in abeyance for 150 years and then kind of pop up? Well, it has a lot to do with really the legacy of the post-war era. You have, for the first time, really de facto secularists in government, particularly the third and fourth terms of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. This is where you have guys who are sort of committed to what we might call modern secularism show up for the first time. Just doesn't seem to be the case that there's any dialectic like this in the 19th century. Even as Christianity liberalizes and as you have sort of the rise of what we might call liberal Protestantism, no one is suggesting denuding the public order of Christianity in the era. It's a mid-20th century creation. It's a 150-year hop
almost, from 1802 into the late 1840s. Why do we sort of read it backwards like that? Well, we read it backwards really because our own era drank the Kool-Aid of this sort of secular construction. And we haven't really gone back and actually asked, okay, what was going on before these secularist presumptions? Right? We forget how religious our own society was. And the United States has always been quite religious, especially compared to Western Europe. We've sort of drank this Kool-Aid. And the reason why it's important to go back to Jefferson is because Jefferson, and I think this is one of the most important things I point out in the book, Jefferson wasn't popular in his own time when it came to his views on religion. We tend to think, well, he was kind of the majority opinion. No, he wasn't. In 1802, Jefferson is not widely considered the model for how the republic relates to religion. Jefferson is, in his own time, seen as a radical. Very few states in the early republic follow the Jeffersonian model. Even Virginia, Jefferson's home state, following the Jeffersonian model, changes its mind about 10 years in. I'll give you an example. When the University of Virginia is founded in 1819, the early 1820s, they're sort of picking the faculty. And Jefferson, by this point, is not quiet at all about his own religion. He's a deist originally, but he becomes sort of a pretty aggressive Unitarian. But throughout his life, Jefferson doesn't like the institutional church. He doesn't like the church. He views any religious institution as more or less medieval. Whether it's a Catholic church or a Protestant church, he doesn't like it. And so Jefferson, when it comes time to pick who's going to be teaching the religion classes at the University of Virginia, it would have been a combined, what we might call religion and philosophy department, very similar to what we have here. He picks Thomas Cooper, who's a well-known British intellectual who is also a well-known agnostic. Now, that word in 1820 meant something more like atheist than our version of agnostic. So guess what? Thomas Jefferson says, hey, you know who I want teaching religion and philosophy at my new university, my new secular university that all of you people agreed to when we disestablished churches in Virginia in 1785. He says, I want the agnostic guy. And all of the evangelicals who had said, oh yeah, we want to get state religion out of the way, they flip out. And they say, wait, that's not what we meant when we wanted to establish religion. We just wanted to get that Anglican state church out of the way. And Thomas Jefferson says, nuh-uh, what I meant is I want to get basically religion out of the way of religion. I wanted to get these old religious people who are too committed to something like the church out of the way, because what Jefferson actually believed about religion was quite different than even what we might call basic deism. Jefferson's deism was never even really the same as a deist like, say, Benjamin Franklin. One thing to think about Jefferson is he hated the doctrine of the incarnation. He loathed it because he thought it was dirty. And because he thinks it's dirty, he thinks there's a bunch of stuff downstream from not merely the incarnation, but what we might call as historic Christianity, that is essentially inconsistent with the Enlightenment. And the doctrine that he thinks is most inconsistent with the Enlightenment is the doctrine of the Trinity. He calls the Trinity a Cerberus. Cerberus is, of course, the mythical three-headed dog, right, that's at the entrance of hell. And he calls it Athanasius' Cerberus. And he faults two thinkers with the Trinity. The first is Athanasius, as I just mentioned, and the second is John Calvin. So for Jefferson, Athanasius and Calvin are sort of the original sinners who have messed up what he says is a pristine religion of Christ that doesn't have all these institutional commitments like the Christian church and the Trinity and the virgin birth. He wants to get those out of the way. So that's who Jefferson is. And that's not ambiguous in his own time. People know it, right? He's a pretty known scoffer. This is the case not merely in the 1820s, but it's the case when he runs for president in 1800. If you were a public Christian, especially if you were someone who was in one of these offices that we would sort of say is a religious office that is involved in politics, say a federal chaplain, there's a chaplain in the Senate and a chaplain in the U.S. House of Representatives, you were worried about Thomas Jefferson. A good example of one of these is William Lynn. William Lynn was the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was not particularly partisan when he was made chaplain in the 1790s, but in 1800, when it's clear that Jefferson's going to run for office, William Lynn becomes a ferocious Federalist. He probably wasn't even affiliated with the Federalist Party, but he is making the case for the Federalists. Why? Because he says Jefferson doesn't actually honor the Christian religion, and because of that, he's going to wreck public order. Throughout the election of 1800, people make the case that Jefferson's irreligiosity is going to end up bringing about a moral morass, anarchy, things of that nature. And so what's interesting is we might hear that, and to our ears, someone might say, well, that sounds like theocracy, or that sounds Christian nationalism. And what's interesting is William Lynn is actually being very careful. He's actually not talking about the church when he's criticizing Thomas Jefferson. He's not saying that the Church of Christ will go away. There are people who make that claim in the election of 1800, just like in every other subsequent election. But William Lynn's not talking about the church. He's not worried that the gospel will not go forth. He's worried about public order. He thinks that public irreligiosity, public denunciation of historic Christianity will lead to public disorder. He doesn't say when it's going to lead there, but he says this is going to be by pulling out that first little Jenga block. If you pull that out too many times, things are going to collapse eventually. William Lynn is not a theocrat. He actually doesn't care about whether there's a state church or not. But he thinks that irreligiosity will lead to the downfall, and particularly anti-Christian irreligiosity will lead to the downfall of public order and of Republican society. And so as I've written this book, what I want to do is basically say, look, people aren't saying that politics is necessary to save souls. No one thinks that Christian politics is actually having anything to do with what we might call witness. You'll hear this. I'm on Twitter. If you know who I am, you probably know that. So I'm on Twitter, and so I'll see people say things like, people's political decisions affect the witness of the church. That would have been completely foreign to early Republic ministers, lay people, politicians, intellectuals. No one thinks that if I have if I pull the political lever this way, that it has anything to do with the witness of the church. They just don't make that connection. Why? Because they actually have better categories for what's churchly and what's not churchly than we do. What William Lynn is talking about is not the gospel. He's not saying, you know what, people aren't going to get saved and my church is going to be wrecked because Jefferson's irreligious. What he's saying is, look, in the public realm, in the civic realm, in the political realm, you have to have some sort of Christian institutional commitment. You have to keep those, because that's what helps Republican society in a Christian order run. No one's doing church and state. I try to make this point really clear. And I think if there's one thing I want to drive home tonight, these guys aren't doing church and state. They're doing religion and the republic. And I chose that title very specifically for that reason. They're not thinking about the gospel. They're not thinking about the Romans road. No one thinks, okay, well, so-and-so's right wing or so-and-so's left wing. So when they go give, the gospel presentation to someone, it's not going to work. They're not talking about that. They're talking about religion's institutional impact in the political spheres and the civic spheres. They're not doing church. And so I'll leave you with that. I hope you'll get the book. It's, like I said, it has a pretty cover more than anything else. Just get it for the nightstand. But I'll end there. Great being with you tonight. It's fantastic. I hope it's been helpful. I hope if you have questions, please, drop them into David. I'm happy to stick around. School's not started yet. All my syllabi are more or less done, so we can stay relatively late. So I'll stop talking there, and I'll turn it back over to David. Thank you all so much, though.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. See, I have one question so far, so everybody else start adding it into the chat to me. But Rachel, who's a 06 alumna, was wondering about your comments in regards to missionaries and like how did that play into sense of manifest destiny? And maybe, I don't know, just share a little bit more of kind of like maybe some of the national narrative and how missionaries played a role in that.
Yeah, so it's actually a great question. And what's completely interesting is that most of the missionary efforts kind of begin before the era of quote unquote manifest destiny. There's a famous missionary couple that's murdered, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. They're murdered in the Pacific Northwest. They're actually killed before what you might call the en masse political development of the West. So the missionaries are actually out there first. The wagon trains follow the missionaries, not the other way around. And what's interesting is on the wagon trains, you think about the Oregon Trail, everybody sort of going west. Those aren't particularly religious populations that are traveling. Manifest destiny isn't a very religiously coded thing. In fact, some of the missionaries are actually wanting to halt settlement. So the missionaries, actually, there's a significant tension there with them and what we might call the political movement behind manifest destiny. A great thing to look at is, you'll probably remember it from the reader, John O'Sullivan. If you still have your American Heritage reader, the John O'Sullivan reading. John O'Sullivan is not a particularly religious person. He kind of creates this Americanized Christianity, or what might be a better way to say is sort of religiousized America, where he basically says that America is the church. He has no sort of interest in historic Protestant or Catholic religiosity. He basically makes America his church. In fact, he says at one point, the gates of hell will not prevail against, he actually uses that term, and it's not against the church, it won't prevail against America. John O'Sullivan's sort of a lapsed Catholic who doesn't really care about religion as religion anymore. So that document, I think, shows you that there is actually a pretty big space between the ideology behind manifest destiny and the ideology and what might be traditional Christianity, be it Roman Catholic or Protestant.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, Rachel put in the comments, said that's actually true for my family, Lutheran pastors who stopped in the Dakotas. That was far enough. So, all right. Let's see here. Yeah, I personally just kind of like thinking a lot about the First Amendment. It's been really eye-opening just to see like, oh, okay, like, well, clearly this is not what they had in mind.
Yeah.
I mean, you went through like a huge list of, did you mention tests for office?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
briefly.
you mentioned that, diplomacy, Sabbath laws, missionary universities, blasphemy laws. Yeah, it really has made me rethink, what does that mean? What does that mean when we're guaranteeing people's freedoms for their rights? So you said that even University of Michigan had
They have an office, or excuse me, a professorship that's basically meant to kind of do apologetics. University of Indiana and University of South Carolina actually put it on the book. So one thing I mentioned in there, I'll go find it. I opened my chapter on on education with a guy named John Lathrop, and he was the president of the University of Wisconsin. And he said that he was educating his students. This is at the University of Wisconsin, the very end of the 1840s. Wisconsin becomes a state in 1848. And he says he wants to educate men of the world. That sounds great. But men who understand that they are, quote, subjects of God's moral government, and whose lives are, quote unquote, regulated by Christian ethics, unshaken in the Christian faith, and who drink deep of the Christian spirit and are animated by Christian hope. That's the president of University of Wisconsin saying that's his mission, to educate this type of person. And so there's just not a lot of ambiguity about that at all. They're pretty open about it. Whether or not they end up having one of these actually sort of apologetics professors, like some of the universities do, that's what their mission is. And you see that at what's now the University of Delaware. You see that at Miami, University of Ohio. You see that almost pretty much every major Southern university and every major Northern state school. And there's not that many of them. The Morrill Act in 1862 will create a lot of what we think of as state universities in the northern states. But the ones that are there in the 19th century are University of Michigan, Miami, University of Ohio, University of Indiana, what becomes Syracuse University, the University of Wisconsin. Those are the ones that are there. Minnesota and Iowa are a bit too late. They become states a bit too late to actually start cranking out state universities. So
Let's see here. Well, I guess we don't have any more questions. I'll ask my own question.
Okay.
I think you know, and I don't expect you to speak in an official capacity, but Hillsdale, you know, you came in 14, and I graduated in 12, and we have some people, you know, here who were students before, and so the more kind of public religiosity of Hillsdale College itself, maybe you, again, not officially, but just kind of like, what are some of your observations as you've studied this period? Because I think maybe some of the older alumni, they're like, well, we were more libertarian.
yeah,
And so I think what you're saying, you know, in this book resonates so much with what I see at Hillsdale now. Is like, we're not a church, right? Like,
Right.
it's not like we have some kind of like gospel mandate, but we also want our students, like you just said, for, you know, Wisconsin, I would say that's probably how a lot of people here think about it. I don't know if you could just.
yeah. I think that when Hillsdale's founded, I've read the college catalog from the 1850s. The best preserved one I have is from 1857, and there's another really good one from 1862. And so, you know, it's officially it's supported by Baptists, but it's pretty much kind of doing, I think, something similar that we do now. It's a sort of a non-sectarian but publicly efficacious Christian observance. One of the things the language I use in the book about people in the early republic, and I think it's similar to the way that Hillsdale understands it. Is like healthy Christian people have a necessary and salutary effect on the people around them, on the community around them. So what it means is, look, if you're doing Christian virtue ethics, and that doesn't mean you can't read the classics too, right? A good Christian should probably be reading Plato and Aristotle as well. It means that, guess what? It's going to play into how you operate in the civil order. It's going to play into how you interact with your neighbor. And so I think it's just that recognition that Christianity has some sort of salutary effect on the people who practice it, and that practice doesn't need to be churchly, right? We don't have to go to church together. We don't have to agree on every doctrinal tick, but there's something almost kind of natural about the way that it affects the society around it. Like, it orders us towards certain things, towards certain social goods. I think that the founders of Hillsdale recognized that. that a lot of people in the early republic recognize that. And I think the college cares about, caring well for its neighbors, caring well for the country. And so in as much as what we teach about Christianity, say in the Western Heritage Reader, is not to make people churchy, right? We're not doing, it's not a gospel message and there's no altar call. I grew up Presbyterian, we don't do altar calls, but there's no one who's sort of saying, hey, are you a Christian now? Do you accept it? No one's doing that, but we're recognizing that these ideas and what these people believe about their faith, what they believe about the morality and ethics that go with their faith has a positive effect on the world around them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we got a question here. So this is from let's see, from Grant and Taryn Boys. I understand the Civil War is just outside the scope of the book. However, where are the divergences in thought about religion and republic between the respective church leaders or public figures in the Union and Confederacy?
Yeah, so again, a great question. Grant's a military man, so it's a good question. I actually answer that, and I think I'll just read this. The proposition is that the Civil War, and a lot of historians say this too. Mark Knoll, who's sort of the dean of Protestant scholarship, in some ways says this. He basically, this is what he writes, and if Grant can put up with me, I'm going to read this. That Mark Knoll wrote that American national culture had been built in a substantial part by voluntary and democratic appropriation of Scripture. And what Knoll proposes, and this is me talking now, that the democratic and voluntarist nature of religion in the United States is what led to such violent disagreements over slavery and biblical interpretation. And so what I'd like to propose, and Grant, I hope this answers your question a little bit. I don't think that Knoll is inaccurate, but I don't think this takes into effect and into account the institutional foundation of Christianity in the States. And I'm reading from the book now, it's on page 85. Knoll's anarchical interpretation does not take into account the fact that appropriation of religion was not always as democratic and as voluntarist as modern historians might assume. And whatever democratic and voluntarist dispositions did exist, did not make the marriage of religion and law any less authoritative in the minds of 19th century Americans. And this is a quote from Knoll. The book that made the nation was destroying the nation. And so basically, essentially, the Bible creates a sort of anarchy and religion creates a sort of anarchy. This is me talking again. In fact, the contest seems to have been rooted not in Protestant anarchy, but in Protestant institutionalization. Abraham Lincoln rightly noted that pro-slavery and anti-slavery Protestants read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and invoked his aid against the other. The Civil War was less the book destroying the nation than a contest between two durable, institutionalized Protestant orders, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. The Union victory in the Civil War did not make the Southern states' political order any less Protestant, but it did make it free. So I think what I would propose is that I don't think that it's anarchy. I think it's actually two very durable orders in its own way. Both largely Protestant, both disestablished, but nonetheless, both very durable. So I don't see it as anarchy so much as two very hard, durable Protestant institutional orders colliding. So that's, I don't know if that's a bit of a different answer. I know it's a little bit of a juke, but I think, I don't know if there's that much change at the Civil War. I think that they both end up being free. The slave order, the pro-slavery Christian order goes away. the Civil War, I don't think of is necessarily as much of a point of departure as other historians might. I'm still sort of teasing that out. This is the first in what I think will be a series of 3 books. But I'm not sure the Civil War is so much a point of departure. I would push it back later, probably into the 20th century in some ways.
All right, well, thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for sending in your questions. And yeah, we look forward, as Dr. Smith at the beginning said, we love it when you guys can come back, but we also understand some of you are a long ways away, maybe in the Dakotas. So you know, hopefully you can tune in, and we look forward to seeing you again, whether that's digitally or hopefully in person. So thank you again, Dr. Smith.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, everyone have a great night.